In April of 1967, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Friendship, Wisconsin, a 29-year-old farmer named Harlon Voss paid $35 for a 1952 Farmall Super M that had absolutely no engine inside it. The tractor was sitting at the edge of the property, looking like a forgotten rusted skeleton. The hood was completely empty, and you could stand at the front grill and look straight through to the firewall. The auctioneer almost did not even bother listing it for sale. A local scrap dealer offered $20 just for the heavy iron weight, but Harlon quietly raised his hand and bid $35. Nobody else bid. The crowd stared at him in absolute silence, thinking he was completely out of his mind. Harlon loaded the empty red shell onto his flatbed truck and drove toward his farm. On the way, he passed the local co-op where a wealthy and arrogant John Deere dealer named Neil Austerman was leaning against the doorframe. Neil saw the engineless Farmall on the back of Harlan's truck and started laughing so hard his face turned red. He immediately started mocking Harlon to all the men standing around the parts counter. Neil loudly declared that Harlon had just wasted his money on a useless tin can with wheels. By the end of that week, the entire county was treating Harlon like a joke. The local men at the diner laughed and asked if the junkyard farmer was planning to buy a combine with no header next. They laughed because it is always easy for arrogant men to mock a quiet farmer they do not understand. But let me tell you about Harlon Voss, because the people laughing had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. Harlon was the son of a German immigrant named Fritz Voss, who had come to central Wisconsin in 1928. Fritz had bought 140 acres of sandy, marginal ground that the wealthier farmers simply did not want. But Fritz possessed something much more valuable than rich soil. He was a master machinist who had trained in Stuttgart, Germany, and he had a mechanical genius that bordered on magic. Because his sandy soil did not produce massive crop yields, Fritz survived by building and repairing equipment that nobody else in the county could fix. He had built a legendary workshop on their farm, filling it with a heavy lathe, a milling machine, a forge, and specialized tooling he had salvaged from bankrupt city factories. Growing up in that shop, Harlon learned everything. By the time he was 15, he could weld flawlessly and he understood metal tolerances down to the thousandth of an inch. Fritz taught his son to look at machines differently. He always said, a factory only builds what it can sell, but a master machinist builds exactly what he needs. When Fritz died of a sudden heart attack right there in his workshop in 1965, he left his son, the farm, the incredible tools, and a brilliant mechanical mind. So when Harlon looked at that empty $35 Farmall frame sitting on his flatbed truck, he did not see a piece of junk. He saw the heaviest and best balanced tractor frame ever built. He saw a blank canvas waiting for a heart. And Harlon did not panic about the missing engine because he already had a monster hiding in his barn that was going to change everything. Let me tell you about the engine, because this is where the story goes from odd to extraordinary. 6 months before the auction, in October of 1966, Harlon had driven 40 miles north to Fort McCoy for a military surplus sale. The Army regularly sold off decommissioned equipment, and farmers in central Wisconsin often bought pallets of old tools and canvas for pennies on the dollar. But Harlon was not looking for canvas. He was hunting for a very specific piece of machinery. He was looking for a Continental CD 193 diesel engine. The Army used these heavy four-cylinder powerhouses to run massive electrical generator sets and air compressors. The official factory specifications claimed the engine produced only 48 horsepower. But Fritz Voss had once examined one of these engines and told his son the military was intentionally hiding its true potential for reliability reasons. Fritz knew the engine easily produced nearly 60 horsepower along with massive low-end torque. Even better, it was a diesel engine. The original Farmall Super M ran on expensive gasoline and wore out quickly under heavy pulling. A military diesel would run on cheap fuel, last forever, and pull through the heavy sand of Adams County without breaking a sweat. Harlon found his engine sitting on a wooden pallet covered in thick olive drab green paint. The Army was getting rid of a perfectly running engine simply because the generator it was attached to was considered obsolete. Harlon paid exactly $85 for a military diesel beast that would have cost over $1,200 brand new. So when he paid $35 for the empty tractor frame, 6 months later he already had the ultimate heart waiting in his barn. He had a total of $120 invested while Neil Austerman was selling his cheapest tractors for over $7,000. But having the engine and the frame was only the beginning of the story. The Continental diesel was never meant to fit inside a Farmall tractor. Absolutely nothing matched. The engine mounts were in the wrong places. The bell housing bolt patterns were completely different. The crankshaft flange was a different size, and the cooling systems were totally incompatible. If you asked any certified mechanic at the local dealership, they would tell you that combining these two completely different machines was physically impossible. A factory engineer would look at the measurements and tell you to give up. But Harlon did not care what factory engineers thought. As the harsh Wisconsin winter set in, Harlon rolled the empty red frame into his shop. He closed the heavy wooden doors and locked himself inside with the two machines and a pile of scrap steel. He had no blueprints, no computers, and no instruction manuals. All he had was his father's heavy lathe, a milling machine, a roaring forge, and the absolute certainty that he could build whatever he needed. He started with the adapter plate, a 1-inch thick piece of steel, machined to mate the Continental engine to the Farmall transmission housing. He spent 3 weeks on this single part, measuring both housings down to the thousandth of an inch. The plate had to be absolutely perfect because even a fraction of an inch off center would cause the drivetrain to vibrate itself apart in a single season. Then came the flywheel adapter and the custom engine mounts fabricated from heavy plate steel and welded directly to the Farmall frame rails. For 5 long months, he spent every single night after his farm chores and every weekend standing under the glowing shop lights, measuring, cutting, and welding in absolute silence. He was about to perform an act of mechanical magic that would shock the entire county and silence every single person who had laughed at him. Let me tell you about the spring of 1968, because that is when the laughing finally stopped. In March, Harlon rolled the red Farmall out of his workshop under its own power for the very first time. The Continental diesel fired on the second crank and settled into an idle that was deeper, smoother, and more authoritative than any machine the factory had ever produced. The exhaust note was completely wrong for a standard farm tractor. It was a deep, military growl, coming from beneath a red hood, sounding like an armored tank crossed with a combine harvester. Harlon drove it straight to his south field and hooked up a heavy 4-bottom plow. The original Farmall with its gasoline engine would have struggled to pull 3 bottoms through that sandy ground without stalling. Harlon dropped all 4 plowshares into the earth, opened the throttle, and the military diesel pulled them through the dirt like it was running downhill. It had more torque, more power, and it burned fuel. That was a fraction of the cost. The $160 machine was outperforming tractors that cost 60 times as much. The neighbors noticed immediately because you simply could not miss it. That deep diesel rumble traveled far across the flat Wisconsin farmland. Men who had stood around the parts counter laughing at the engineless frame a few months ago were now standing at their fence lines, watching Harlon effortlessly rip through his fields. By the end of the week, the stories reached Neil Austerman at his John Deere dealership. Half a dozen farmers came in talking about the military diesel monster Harlon Voss had built from absolute scrap. Neil decided to drive out to the Voss farm that Saturday, expecting to see a dangerous, cobbled-together mess that he could easily mock. He found Harlon in the yard, performing routine maintenance on the machine. Neil walked around the tractor, slowly looking for something to criticize. He crouched down and spent 15 minutes examining the undercarriage. He looked at the custom 1-inch steel adapter plate, the isolated engine mounts, the modified cooling system, and the heavy-duty fuel lines. When Neil finally stood up, the arrogant smile had completely vanished from his face. The work was absolutely flawless. It was professional engineering that matched and in some ways exceeded the quality of the brand new tractors sitting on his own showroom floor. Neil quietly asked how much power the engine was producing. Harlon told him it made nearly 60 horsepower at the drawbar, outclassing the original factory engine by a massive margin. Then Neil asked the question he had been dreading. He asked how much the entire build had cost. Harlon laid out the math. $35 for the empty frame, $85 for the military surplus engine, and roughly $40 in raw steel and hardware. $160 total. Neil Austerman sold tractors for a living, and the absolute cheapest machine on his lot cost over $7,000. He was staring at a hand-built masterpiece that outperformed half of his expensive inventory. For the first time in his entire career, the arrogant dealer had absolutely nothing to say. He turned around, got in his truck, and drove away in complete humiliated silence. Let me tell you about the next 15 years, because the Frankenstein Farmall, as the county called it, was just the beginning. Harlon farmed his 140 acres with the diesel Super M from 1968 onward, and the Continental engine never missed a single day of work. It started flawlessly in January at 20 degrees below zero, when the expensive gasoline engines completely refused to turn over. It pulled harder, ran cooler in the summer heat, and required absolutely nothing more than routine oil changes. By 1982, the surplus engine had logged thousands of grueling hours without a single major repair. During the 1970s agricultural boom, Neil Austerman sold John Deere tractors as fast as the factory could build them. He convinced the local farmers to expand on credit, pushing them to buy massive, shiny machines with air-conditioned cabs and staggering price tags. The men who had laughed at Harlon gladly signed 5-year loans, believing the good times would never end. But Harlon ignored the boom. His $160 tractor had no monthly payments. His land was completely paid off. His workshop owed nothing to any bank. He grew corn and soybeans on his sandy ground, earning modest yields, but his profit was entirely real. With near-zero overhead, Harlon quietly put away $6,000 to $8,000 every single year. By the time the 1980s arrived, he had secretly accumulated $78,000 in cash. Then, the devastating farm crisis hit Adams County like a sledgehammer. Interest rates skyrocketed above 18%, while corn prices collapsed below $2 a bushel. Land values were instantly cut in half. The men who had mocked the engineless tractor frame, the men who had financed $30,000 machines just to look successful, were suddenly drowning in insurmountable debt. Adams County began to lose farms to bank foreclosures. Neil Austerman watched helplessly as his wealthy customers went bankrupt and his dealership lot filled up with repossessed equipment that nobody could afford to buy. In the fall of 1984, a neighboring property known as the Kreger Place went to a foreclosure auction. It was 180 acres of land directly adjoining Harlan East fence line. The bank auctioneer started the bidding at a miserable $200 an acre. A wealthy speculator from Milwaukee tried to bully his way in and push the price up, but Harlan held his ground and ultimately won the bid at $310 an acre. Harlan stepped forward and handed the auctioneer a single check for $55,800, pure cash, no financing, no bank approvals, no interest rates. The entire auction yard went absolutely silent. The sudden collective realization washed over the crowd. The quiet farmer with the scrap metal tractor was the only man writing cash checks while everyone else was begging for loan extensions. Neil Austerman was standing in the yard watching his empire crumble. He walked slowly over to Harlan, took off his cap, and rubbed his forehead. Neil confessed that he had spent 2 decades selling progress and the future, but the man who showed up with a $35 tin can was the one buying land while his best customers were losing everything. Harlan looked at the defeated dealer and pointed out a brutal truth. He said Neil's customers bought their farms on credit while he built his from scrap, and that was the $55,000 difference. Neil finally extended his hand and apologized for laughing all those years ago. He admitted that Harlan had been building better machines in a dusty barn than the factory had ever delivered to his showroom. Let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with this one for a moment. What do you see when you look at an empty, rusted tractor frame? Most people see absolutely nothing. They see scrap metal waiting for the crusher. Neil Austerman saw a joke. The whole county saw a man wasting $35 on a tin can with wheels. But Harlon Voss saw something else. He saw the heaviest and best balanced frame ever built, just waiting for a heart. He saw his father's tools and a lifetime of machining skill. That is the ultimate difference between a buyer and a builder. A buyer only sees what is sitting on the dealership lot with a massive price tag. A builder sees what could be. A buyer pays whatever the salesman demands, but a builder pays what the raw metal is worth and adds the value himself. The best machines are not sitting in a showroom. They are built in dusty barns by men with quiet minds and steady hands. Now, before we finish, I want to share a small secret with you. While the mechanical genius and the stubborn spirit of this tale beat in the heart of every rural American town, the specific names and events like Harlon and his military diesel monster are a carefully crafted legend. It is a fictional tribute dedicated to the countless quiet farmers across this country who fix what others throw away and build empires from the scrapyard.
If you believe in the power of old iron and the undeniable genius of the American farmer, please hit that like button and subscribe to the Farm Legacy. Go down to the comments right now and tell me about the oldest or toughest piece of machinery you have ever seen working out in the fields. Until next time, always remember that the best investment you can ever make is simply believing in your own 2 hands.